Okay, I think we can start. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our talk. Stefan Evers and me from Bosch Software Innovations are going to try to tell you about our adventure becoming, kind of a bigger open source contributor among the traditional manufacturing industries, probably. In particular, we want to talk to you about the fact that if Robert Bosch can do it, then you can probably do it as well if you come from a similar background. By the way, so this is Robert Bosch. This is the founder of the Bosch Group, the Bosch company. And we are going to tell you a little about how it all started, what we did to come into a position to be actually able to do open source within Bosch, to actually not only consume open source, but also contribute to open source and do even a little more than that. And I guess without further ado, I think we should travel back in time, and Stefan is going to tell you how it all started.
Yeah, so we go back to 2013. That is like roughly the time when open source became like a certain focus for Bosch. So the situation then was that it was widely spread over inside Bosch, of course also outside Bosch, but the interesting part for us, it was spread inside Bosch a lot, meaning that we realized it has to be more structured than the way it was before, in particular how we use open source. On the other hand, IoT, which has been quite a good, important topic at that time for Bosch, because we are a things company, and that was also the case at that point. And IoT became more important before, and we realized the server-client things maybe are not the solution for the future. Maybe we have to look into the cloud and cloud technologies. In parallel, we went to a lot of, like several people went to several Eclipse cons, so we got more and more in contact with the open source community, with the Eclipse Foundation, also with other foundations, but that was the place for particularly here in Ludwigsburg, where it was easy for us to go. And so we had a lot of conversation around many things, and we realized, oh, that's something that is like a topic we should address. One thing was like a keynote that Mike did, and this is just like a representation of all the things, like the things that were coming towards us. And that is like the first slide of that, why open source will drive IoT innovation. And so we had to think about, okay, what does that actually mean for Bosch?
Yeah, and by that time in 2013, we were already working a little in the IoT area, and I was not I personally, but we with our team were experimenting with CoAP at that time, and so we needed an implementation of a CoAP framework of the CoAP protocol, and we found one, and soon discovered I would need to make some changes here and there to adapt it to our needs. So it became necessary to actually contribute to that project a little. So me having only consumed open source in the past, for me this was a new thing, but I knew, okay, I would probably need to get a GitHub account, so I did that. That was in 2013. And then on the very next day, I created my first pull request for Californium. However, I was not allowed to do that as part of my Bosch work time, so I did this on the weekend during my private time, which is not so uncommon for open source development, but since we used it in our project at work, it was kind of a not so good situation from my point of view. But anyway, it worked. I made some changes. I created a pull request, used my own private email address to do the pull request, and that worked a little. However, it was not perfect.
Yeah, so things like that, like getting open source into like a huge company with like over 400,000 people and a lot of regulations. I think you cannot imagine, like people not coming from a big corporation, you cannot imagine how many regulations there are, which makes sense because you need to protect this big entity. So like, but on the other hand, you have this little new plant, fragile plant like open source that wants to grow and that wants to become something, and it's so easy to destroy it. So you need to protect it, and you need to find a setting that is actually working so it can prosper, it can grow. On the other hand, of course, there are these threats for like this big ship that might lead to very severe consequences. So you need to protect this big ship so it's not going down like this one. So you need to find a balance between these two things. In the case of open source, it is a lot, don't regulate it to death on the one side. On the other side, don't make it so open that actually people that do not want to do harm but do not understand all the aspects of all these things in this big corporation side do a lot of big harm to the reputation, to the legal side, everything like that. One example that we had was we tried to balance what an individual developer on the one side has, what the approval process he has to go through and what all the hoops he has to jump through, and not demotivate him. And this particular thing, what we did was at the beginning, you're protected. Like when you start to ride a bike, it's the same thing. You have these extra wheels, and when you learn to do it in a proper way, then you give you much more freedom, so you can do it on your own responsibility. So actually, that's the thing that always happens, in particular in big companies, but I think it's everywhere. Like first, you have to climb this ladder of maturity. So first, you go from usage, and at the end, you go every step up to the point where you're actually leading projects. And this is a long way, and it's a long way for an individual person, but in particular, it's a long way for a company. So this is like, just to give you an imagination what we are talking about. This is like the workflow that we build up for contribution approvals. I will not go through the details, but it's just like that you have an idea. And so the top part is actually for the person, for the developer. Then the middle part, that is about the project. And the lower part is about the contribution, the code itself. So that is like we separated in 3 different parts, 3 different steps. And you can imagine there's a lot more like that in the background. For usage, there is at least as complex regulations and things like that. And the big point is how to do that in a way that developers can live with it, but you can still protect the big tanker.
Wait a second. One thing that I want to add. This looks complicated at first, and it is for a person that does his first contribution within the organization. So when he is completely new to open source, we want to minimize the risk that he's doing something stupid. Maybe whether that is intentionally or not, but we want to minimize the risk. So there are certain safeguards in place to prevent him from doing something stupid. However, once you become a frequent contributor to a project, the constraints that you have to take on in this process get lower and lower, or less and less, until you become a committer on a project where you basically can do whatever you want, because people know you know what you're doing, and we trust what you're doing. So this is if I had to go through this process with every contribution I make to my projects, I would have left the company already. So.
Not only you.
Yeah. Oh, okay, so 1 year later, we had this process in place, and that was also the time that we created our own organization on GitHub, because now we wanted to make sure or allow all of our employees to actually work on open source in a safe and guarded environment. So we created this organization, and now the employees of Bosch Software Innovations become members of this organization and work on open source projects in this context and under the process that we have seen. Having done this in 2014 also allowed us to start our first open source project ourselves. So that was Eclipse Vorto, and by the end of the year, we actually had the proposal approved and did our first contribution, the initial contribution. Had our first committers on board, who were then, by then, of course, already were subject to the process that you have seen.
So we've tried many things. First, we regulated the open source usage, we structured that. We got people on board. We had the first trial, how to do it. We started our first project. And then finally, in 2015, we felt like that we now have a good feeling what it means and what we can do. And so we could apply it actually to IoT, and we could make it part of our strategy. And so that was on the EclipseCon here in Ludwigsburg. Stefan Ferber gave a keynote where he actually announced what we want to do in the future. And he explained how open source is important for us, and like teaching old dogs new tricks. That's exactly like he was talking about already at that point, that it's not that easy actually to change the things inside our organization. So that was the key slide, because that explained our open source strategy. What you see in there, the important part is, of course, we wanted to do IoT, and then, but the assumption in the middle is actually that what led to the open source strategy. So first of all, we said 2 to 5 major IoT platforms will be there in a few years, and one out of them will be open source. And for us as an industrial manufacturer, we will not be able to place a proprietary platform in the market. And even if we would be able to do that, our partners and our competitors and everyone, they would not allow that. This is just not the way industrial manufacturing works. So on the other hand, we didn't want to depend on any third-party platform because it was just too risky to put all our business on that. So the only way for us, that was like then the logical consequence, was going on an open source strategy with an open platform.
So at EclipseCon 2015, we had up front, we had invited several other interested parties who were interested in creating an IoT cloud backend. Stefan had talked to several people from other companies during the year already, or during the year before, at other EclipseCons in North America and where not. And so we all gathered here in Ludwigsburg 2015 and drew this picture on a whiteboard and said, yeah, that is functionality that we think we should have in open source. And then once we had agreed on that, we actually created a proposal for the Eclipse Hono, which is exactly the manifestation of what you saw in the picture before. So the important point to make here is that there had been interested parties from other companies as well. In particular, we're doing this with Red Hat. At the time being, GE was also a little involved. The important message here is, my personal belief is that you're much more successful with starting an open source project if from the beginning you have already collaborators from different organizations that can work with you together on that. It is much harder to start it on your own and then try to find contributors to it. It's more appealing to people working on something that has very little code base when not all decisions have been made yet, than it is to join a party late where all the interesting discussions have already been led. So what this meant then for us, once we had started to do this, and in the meantime we have started additional IoT projects as well, it was obvious that we could no longer pursue a model where we would sell software licenses and that would be the business model, because the software basically was freely downloadable from GitHub. So what we then did was started changing the business model to a software as a service model, and create a commercial product based on the open source projects that we're working on. And this is the Bosch IoT Suite. This is an open platform, as you see, based on Eclipse IoT. We basically operate the cloud services for you so that you can just use the functionality. What this, however, also meant was that it had a big impact on the development process. So in the past, our product teams were just Bosch internal, so we, as many others, started doing agile development based on Scrum. And one of the strengths of Scrum is that you have this time-boxed development cycles, that you have everything under control. You can have your team commit on the dates, on the functionality, and on the features that they are able to do in a sprint. However, once you do open source, you cannot really do that. At least I think you cannot really do that anymore, because frankly, I cannot make Dejan from Red Hat adhere to our sprint dates or commit to any features that he will be implementing in the next 4 weeks in Hono, so that we have it at the end of the sprint. So what we do at Bosch is that we basically synchronize on the product backlog. So our product owner puts in stuff there, and every 3 months we sit down with him and create a roadmap for the next 3 months ahead of the product team, with features that we need to implement in the open source space together with our partners. But then only in 3 months will our product team be in a position to actually leverage that and build upon that in order to productize it. So we're always 3 months ahead, and that gives us enough space to make adjustments, to account for personal days off, for other project priorities, whatever. So that works for us. I think that is a workable process. Others within our organization actually try to do the open source development within the sprint as well. I cannot talk about what their results are. I personally believe that the way we do it is much more appropriate for the open source development way. However, it did not only have an impact on our product's development, but also on the other functions around the product.
Yeah. So the question that typically is very asked very soon is, yeah, okay, guys, open source sounds nice, but what is about the money? Can you still earn money? You're like giving away your technology. What is it? And that is, I think, something that is a fair question, but it has been asked for a long time. And you can see, like Red Hat, for example, is earning quite a lot of money with open source. And when you look why, the question is can be answered simply because what is a customer looking for? So of course, when you want to have a salad, you can go and you can like plant a salad like out there, and then you can at some point harvest it, and then you can like bring it to somewhere, and then you can do all these things, and then you can also like maybe even do the dishes by yourself. But at the end of the day, what the person wants when you're sitting at the table is he want to have it like served in the way he wants that right now. So he want to have a service. So that is like the thing that you have to keep in mind. The technology is something that you load down from a website. That is not something that gives you the functionality that you need. There's a lot of things that need to be done around it, in particular these days with cloud. With cloud, you even operate it when you're like selling it. And all that together is more or less that you're like, what the customer is buying is this. And of course, it's not done when once it is prepared. Of course, it's also needs to be kept running all the time, and that is also a lot of things. So the software itself is not what you're selling. You're going into a software as a service business model, and that's what we've done. Of course, one big factor is competition, because competition stays, but you compete typically on another level. You build the technology together, but you compete on the business. And you have to make sure that actually the critical factors that differentiate you from your competition is still there. And on the other hand, that you make sure that you're not giving away these parts that are really essential for your business part. This is a little bit more tricky and have to be looked at every single business case. But for example, in our business case, we say, yeah, it makes sense. And if you don't do it in the right way, then you have a problem. So the point is that you actually create together. The technology is created together, and you let all the people that are participating in there, your customers, everyone who gives you feedback, every bug report, every feedback, like on like a conference, wherever you go, you get feedback and you get it early, even if the people do not build with you. Better it is, of course, if the people build with you, because then together you build a technology that is like much more that what is needed than if you do that behind walls for years and then come out and say, hey, do you actually need this stuff? And then often the question, the answer is no.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, for example, yeah. So at the end, the community is the key, and it's really important to have a vivid community that is like having a lot of different participants, and that is like also where you can see if a community is really successful. And the additional thing that this community then has is freedom, because it has the freedom from these from all the things that typically you see in a closed environment like in a big corporation. So you can use that and build the technology out there with the freedom, and then you can take it back to the constraints that you have if you want to bring out a service with a product with an SLA. So for example, you can make many decisions that out there in an open source project that would not fit into a situation where you're tied to like the SLA or the product roadmap or whatever. So the other thing is that, of course, you use that then because you market the technology. You have two different things. The technology is marketed out there with the community, and you're like saying that first. So the technology has to win, and then when the technology is the choice of the corresponding customer, then you can win the business in the corresponding field. So, but it's two different things, and that is working quite well because it's actually also really a costly thing to position a technology and make it like worth in the market.
Okay, now we've seen the impact that it has on sales and marketing within a corporation. It also has a big impact on you as a developer. At least it had on me. So I have been developing software for Bosch for 20 years now, and only the last 3.5 years I've been doing open source. And I consider this to be a firmware upgrade for me, for myself, for how I work. And in particular, the first and most important thing that I perceived was as soon as I started working on open source or spending more time there, I was totally outside of my corporate bubble. So in the past, I was mostly speaking to other Boschies, as we call them, other Bosch people, and it was mostly about talking stuff that would, only be of interest to ourselves, would have an impact on ourselves. And now immediately you start speaking with people outside of the bubble, in particular with potential customers, with people you work together on the technology, and they have a completely different view of the world. And this is very valuable because you get input from them and get triggered, get new ideas that you would never have had yourself within your bubble. So the first thing then, however, to follow is be nice to your community. And the people who know me personally know how hard this is for me sometimes, but I really try. In particular, you have to be nice to people who ask stupid questions from your point of view, but we all do that. I mean, when we started working on a new project, you don't know nothing about it, so you ask stupid questions as well, I guess. So, but that is not a thing. The more important thing, I guess, is style of communication changes. In particular, has to become more transparent, more public. So you can no longer talk only to your colleagues, discuss a problem, implement the solution, and then that's it, and commit it to GitHub. That doesn't really make sense because part of the whole fun in the project is being part of these discussions. And if you want to include others in the public into these discussions, then you have to lead these discussions in the public, on the mailing list, on Gitter, on GitHub, you name it. However, some people do not really get that at first. So in the beginning, I had to turn down requests from my colleagues who literally sit right next to me and ask me about, hey, can you fix this, or how do we do that? And then I would simply say, I can tell you now, but then I would have to shoot you. No, that is not what I had to say. But please ask the question on GitHub or on Stack Overflow, then we answer that so everybody can take advantage of that. This is kind of strange because you're sitting right next to you, and if you had been working on a Scrum team, for example, where communication and direct communication is everything, this is completely new style of communication for you. Then another thing that is, from my point of view, very cool in the open source world is that you value code over hierarchy. So nobody really knows what your rank within your organization is in the outside world. And all they care about is how many commits have you made? Did you make contributions that are valuable? Did you implement good features? Are you publicly visible for the project? That is something that is of value. That is the meritocracy in open source. What I experienced personally is that it expands my portfolio of capabilities. So I have never been a great marketer of what I did. However, and I'm still not, but I at least have to try now. I have to go to conferences, talk about what I'm doing. I have to at least invest some thought in how can we make this more attractive? How can we build a community? And these are new things that you have to explore and that you have to also accept. But it's also, fun exploring your new capabilities or at least challenges. Acting responsibly is, of course, very, very important if you're in a corporation like I am, because everybody wants to sue you, basically, because there is money to be got. So you really need to think before you commit something to GitHub, putting internal passwords there or your comments from your internal chat channel is probably not a good idea, so you have to really act responsibly. Managing interest is also a big issue. Interest in particular, I mean conflicting interests. So my product manager has interests regarding the features that get into the commercial offering that we have. However, those interests often are in conflict with what is good for the open source project that I'm working on for the next 4 to 6 weeks, whatever. And that is because as a committer, I need to make sure that my open source project is flourishing, and I need to make sure that it is appealing to others in the community or from other communities. I need to try to tap into other ecosystems and get their interest in the technology that I'm building. However, that might not always be something. Oh, that's bad. It might not be something that is of immediate interest to my product owner and the product that we're creating. So I need to find a way to manage these conflicting interests and be able to stand up to my product manager as well and say, I'm sorry, I cannot deliver this feature because I have to do a lot of work for community building as well. And that might not be in your interest in the short run, but in the middle or long run, it is very important because it only makes sense for us to build our product on open source if the underlying open source technology is actually successful. And successful means it has broad adoption and gets contributions. And then last but not least, of course, this is a lot of fun. So for me, at least, this was the best thing of it all. Breaking out of the company bubble, being in the public, meeting new people, meeting very, very smart people, learning from them, getting new input, being challenged, that was really a great experience. So this, and last but not least, of course, coming to these conferences, talking to guys like you, this is really, this is the best thing ever. So if you want to know a little more about how we're currently doing, then Steffen can give you the numbers, basically.
Yeah, so here you see some of the numbers. I think it's not necessary to go through all of them, but just like that you have a rough feeling for it. For example, down there, it said we are like now with our open source management, we are monitoring 700 applications. Or for example, we have 5,000 open source components that we manage. Or like when you look at the contribution part, like climbing up the ladder, then you see, oh, okay, we have 69 open source projects that we actually have approved for contribution. Or we have 172 frequent contributors, meaning they can do they are flying free. They are like more or less doing that by themselves. But actually, it's not persons because it's like, for example, some developers have frequent contribution approvals for several projects. So I just want to make sure that I'm not faking the numbers here. But I think we have something like, I guess, 50 people that are like on different open source projects that are doing like frequent contributions. And we have 17 projects where we are somehow like involved like committers, and like 5 of them we are actually project leads. And that is just to be clear, that is just Bosch Software Innovations. So as this has been a successful undertaking, and it has been also seen from various parts of Bosch, it has become like an example, and they are now adopting it. For example, you've seen OpenADX. So we are now like trying to apply all the experience that we've found and apply it in other areas as well. And we are also doing that, for example, in the area of open source management itself. So we found, so why don't we do open source management using open source principles? So we're doing it there as well.
So if you think that this is not too bad for a company that is over 130 years old, maybe you want to apply the same in your environment as well, or go on that adventure. But if not, if you instead would rather join us, that is also an option, of course.
And of course, like if you as a company want to go that way, you can also contact us because, or the Eclipse Foundation, we love to help the different companies because like you are potential partners for us in the future on that journey. So thanks a lot.
I think we're at the end. We'll be glad to take some questions if there are any.
We have 5 minutes.
Okay.
So questions? We flashed you.
No.
So the fact that you're now
The question was if now we're doing so much open source, if like we now changed the way doing things, for example, recruitment and. I would say doing open source, and I could even say we are like steering or we're like slowly going towards the direction like Bosch Software Innovations to become like an open source company because so many things internally and they have now changed. I would definitely say that many parts have changed. Also, like recruiting has changed. So we are recruiting different people and they are coming to us through different channels. It has changed how we're doing business. For example, business leads are coming now through the open source technologies as well. We are like marketing has changed. So many things, so many different areas have been touched, and we are doing things differently. It's also a different culture in the company. It's also a different way how we collaborate with partners now, and it's also different. It's different now with which partners we are collaborating. So, for example, I think 5 years ago that we are developing software together with people from Red Hat would have sounded like really strange. Now for us, it's become normal.
Within our product team, I can say, yeah, definitely. So open source or experience in open source development, proven experience in open source development is a big surplus, yes.
Is the top management that wanted to go to open source, or it was, I mean, where exactly does it begin this change in your company? Because I'm looking also for my company to see how to bring this open source spirit, because I think it's in our domain it would be very important. But as I think Bosch is not soft, I mean, it's an industrial company, so you don't have I imagine you don't have, as you say, this culture as other big software companies that perhaps were, or pure software companies that were perhaps used before to collaborate in this way. So where, how the company did to really to change his mind on this.
I think it came from. I think it came from both sides. So it's like I think there have been for a long time already people inside Bosch that wanted to do open source one way or the other. For example, as Kai started in his private time. But I think it's really difficult to do that on that scale. What we showed you, or what we've done without high upper management attention and upper management like approval, or at least
Commitment.
yeah, or commitment. That is not working. So like typically, for example, like the Eclipse Foundation or their people like Mike Milinkovic, they can address that. So typically what is happening is like people from some point in the organization get people like that inside your company, and bring someone like Mike in the company and like talking to the management, maybe level by level. But at the end of the day, I think it needs management commitment.
In our case, I think we were very lucky that Stefan Färber, our current CEO, was convinced of that years ago when he had not yet been our CEO, but already had good or much influence on our then CEO. And so he was able to plant that idea within the organization and foster it and grow it. And now as the CEO, of course, he's in a position to actually foster it and bring it forward even more. But I would also agree that this cannot be a grassroots only undertaking. That doesn't work.
How do you kind of answer internal voices? They say if we go open source, we lose control of what we are doing, because suddenly there is an open source community having control, meritocracy, and so on, and we as company losing control.
I would ask them back. Do you really think you're in control? So like, so there's Kubernetes out there. There's like all the other companies out there, like doing all the IT stuff, cool IT stuff. They're developing the new technology, the future. And you think you have this under control that is happening out there when you're sitting behind your closed doors and like talking to each other? No.
I think it also depends on what you're actually talking about. Are you talking about technology that you can actually collaborate on with others that is not a differentiating factor for the business that you're in? Or are you talking about your deep special knowledge in your application domain, which you probably want to keep as your intellectual property, which actually is a differentiating factor? For the former, I guess that is exactly the argument. Simply doesn't make sense to do that on your own. That is just a rational argument from my point of view. This is usually we have that a lot. This is basically the private pets of engineers. Yeah, they have been working on this for 10 years. They don't want to give it up because it's their personal hobby, basically. Yeah, it's just a rational argument. Yeah, no, you cannot have your own hobby here on our payroll. That doesn't work. And for the other stuff, I think it makes sense. Yeah.
I mean, from the core stuff, it's clear that the differentiating thing is not say the basic stuff that you can share with others.
Yeah.
It may happen that say some other organization takes the lead.
This definitely happens. That is my personal experience. I have been working on proprietary stuff within Bosch for 15 years before I started that. We always worked on something for 2 or 3 years and then realized, well, there is an open source project that does the same thing better with more support, which is widely adopted, widely used. And we are now replacing what we have worked on proprietarily internally with this open source technology because it is better. So you do this twice and then you either are frustrated or you don't care, but then you are a person that I do not want to have in my company anyways.
And you're perfectly right. And the one thing I would add to that is, the people that do commercial products on the top of Eclipse IoT components or Eclipse components, the value they have is that the open source part is a commodity. The special sauce or the special secret is in the commercial product, so to speak, up to a point.
Yeah.
And this is the key. You are in full control of your differentiation at the top. And everything else should be open source because you're reinventing the wheel otherwise.
There is a catch though with that, I guess. Yeah. So you already know the answer. I'm not. I can't tell you anything different. We all know the answer. It's yeah.
The other thing that you always have to keep in mind is it's not about differentiating factors, unique selling points. It's not important at the point when you have the idea about them or when you develop them, but at the point when you compete with someone. And at the point when you compete with someone is typically often years after when you think about it when you have the idea. And that is often what many people like forget, because if you look at what is differentiating at that point, it's typically even much smaller. And then also the other thing is that often if it is like just a little tiny thing and then 99% of everything around it is then done into like an open source area, then it might be nice that you have something differentiating. When the other thing has become a de facto standard, people don't care about that. What they do is they just implement it then in the open source way. So it is a high risk to develop proprietary software in an area where it's very likely that an open source activity is taking place. It is very risky. So if you're risk averse, in many cases, you should go the safe way, meaning you do open source.
Okay. Anything else? If not, then thank you for attending. I hope this was interesting to you. We hope that this was inspiring as well, that you can start your journey towards becoming an open source contributor. And we will be here tomorrow as well. So if you have any more questions that you didn't want to raise publicly, but may want to discuss privately, then there will be plenty of opportunity to do that.
Just contact us.